Doot doot! All aboard the hype train! That's right, kids, it's time to address the rampant elephant in the room of gaming. Hype. On one hand, advertising a game's upcoming release is nigh essential to get even a foothold in the market. But on the other, an oversaturation of promises, scripted footage, and a whole mess of pre-orders can only serve to leave fans very disappointed when it finally drops. There have been so many games which have promised the world only to have delivered content amounting to the Isle of Wight, so let's take a look at the biggest offenders today. Think of this list as a little warning to err on the side of caution when it comes to parting with your pre-order pounds. With this in mind, I'm Jules from WhatCulture.com here with a list of 10 most overhyped video games of all time. Number 10. Haze. It's all but faded from memory now, but there was a time when Haze was the most anticipated game for the PlayStation 3. Created by acclaimed devs Free Radical, who had shot to fame through Time Splitter's monkey shooting action, Haze was looking like it was going to usher in a whole new generation of first-person shooters. Despite the interesting premise of drugging the player, Haze just wasn't particularly any good. Thanks to generic gameplay, dodgy enemy AI, and rubbish writing, the game wouldn't have even stood out on the PlayStation 2. Even the graphics, one of the game's major selling points, just weren't up to scratch, swiftly outdone by just about every other game released early in the PlayStation 3's life. Number 9. Duke Nukem Forever. With a development schedule that was dragged out over 15 years and constant reports of it being abandoned and then resurrected again and again, Duke Nukem Forever had an excruciatingly long build-up before its eventual release. Because of this, the inevitable hype that accompanied the game's eventual foray felt oddly unnatural, as if everyone was just going through the motions because they had to. Although a gameplay trailer almost tricked everyone into half hoping that Duke Nukem Forever just might be the explosive comeback we all wanted, the final release was pretty dire. Forever was just a painfully average crawl, filled with outdated humour, bad level design, and the odd feeling that you were trying to squeeze the fun out of something that had been dead for almost 2 decades. Number 8. Final Fantasy XIII. There was a time when a new Final Fantasy release was a momentous event, as everyone gathered to witness what incredible technical advances that Square Enix had made this time, or what amazing new worlds their team of writers had weaved together. Final Fantasy XIII at first looked like a continuation of this trend. Its mind-blowing good looks and absorbing cinematic trailer wowed audiences everywhere, and fans couldn't wait to jump into this fascinating new universe. Unfortunately, the game was extremely linear, with the first half of the title almost being akin to a corridor simulator. The battle system too was controversial, heavily limiting the player's control over their party compared to previous installments. While the game does have its staunch defenders, no one can deny that after Final Fantasy XII, this felt almost claustrophobic by comparison, and as a result left fans feeling rather flat. Number 7. Titanfall. Now, in terms of how Titanfall plays, I have no issue with the irresistibly fun, free-flowing frenzy that it offered. However, I do take issue with how the game was sold to players. Rather than being an online experience that players could delve into for hundreds of hours, for many players it only had enough depth to be considered a fun distraction for a few weeks. The paper-thin plot was almost insulting on how it used the multiplayer maps and just had you fighting against bots as its basis. And lazy delivery of the narrative meant that players wouldn't even be likely to remember who was who by the end of the game. Now, I wasn't expecting a huge Odyssey narrative, but the trailers and news releases for the game suggested something much bigger, and a more realised world than what was delivered. Number 6. Watch Dogs. When Watch Dogs was announced, it looked set to be the biggest game of the year. Beautiful graphics, an unparalleled immersive world, and the ability to hack just about anything were all selling points that Ubisoft were pushing hard. Things then started to look a bit shaky after the game was delayed for around 6 months. But the stunning E3 appearances had long cemented Watch Dogs' place as one of the most anticipated games of 2014. By the time the game was released, however, it looked nowhere near as good as the pre-release footage. Missions were also linear, and the cars handled terribly. Sadly, Watch Dogs just wasn't as exciting as Ubisoft wanted us to believe, and Grand Theft Auto 5 had already outdone it in just about every single way possible. Number 5. Daikatana. When a game is more famous for its marketing campaign than the end product, you know that something went seriously wrong. Daikatana has become notorious for the bold posters which hyped it up, covered in phrases like "John Romero's about to make you his bitch" and "suck it down." Despite the controversial marketing, Romero was still considered a genius at the time, seemingly incapable of pushing out a bad game. But Daikatana was exactly that. A bad game. In fact, it's widely considered to be one of the worst games ever released, thanks to a ridiculous number of bugs, terrible graphics, and an almost immediate irrelevancy in an industry which at the time had games like Half-Life and Medal of Honor. Number 4. Destiny. For a while, it really looked like Destiny was going to be the next big thing, like Halo or Call of Duty big. Featuring one of the most impressively large-scale marketing campaigns in the history of video games, and with a well-respected developer at the helm, Destiny was one of the most hyped games of all time. Therefore, it was devastating to many gamers when Destiny received subpar review scores from several major publications, and a general consensus that the game was just downright disappointing. The most common complaints were that Destiny just didn't have enough for gamers to do, and what was there felt extremely repetitive. Like Titanfall, it was by no means a bad game, it just didn't have quite enough depth to be elevated to the heights that it was aiming for. Number 3. Spore. Spore was going to be the absolute king of God games. Designed and developed by SimCity creator Will Wright, Spore was in the making for a huge amount of time and with a massive budget to boot. A ridiculously ambitious premise, a colossal amount of talent involved, and no shortage of financial backing, Spore looked to be a surefire hit. Unfortunately, things didn't quite pan out as expected. Pre-release material suggested that Spore would be a transcendent experience, taking you from single-celled organisms all the way up to complex spacefaring civilizations. Instead, other than a pretty fun creature creator, Spore was a hugely underwhelming collection of average minigames, culminating in a lackluster strategy title at the end of it. Number 2. Every Fable game. Oh, Peter Molyneux, it's been a while since you've been on one of my lists, but I should have known when the word hype came up that I'd be seeing your smug rat face. When will you learn to stop promising what you can't deliver? There's no doubt that Molyneux and Lionhead Studios genuinely want to push the limits of video games and give us a genre-pushing revolutionary experience. The problem is they just don't have the ability to do it. Enter the Fable games, which are notorious for not living up to what was originally touted. Promises like a world that grows over time, affected by even your smallest actions, were proven to be false. The good and evil options weren't any different from similar karma systems used in other RPGs, and most of the aging features were limited to purely aesthetic. Genre-breaking immersive gameplay? Is that what you mean when we're in a farting competition with an NPC for the 13,000th time? Peter, just a kind reminder, stop. And number 1, No Man's Sky. Well, I mean, it's a bit of a no-brainer for the top entry of this list, right? When you've got such a notable public backlash to a game which literally promised you the galaxy and then totally burned up in re-entry, it really couldn't be anything else. What started as a mere rumble turned into a screaming crowd of unbelievable hype as devs began to promise more and more about their gargantuan project. But just as suddenly as the immense swell of popularity came, it just as quickly went sour. Gamers were dismayed when features that had been shown off in alpha footage were totally absent. Court cases and refunds followed, and soon the devs were running scared, hemorrhaging sales right out of their asteroids. Like I said in the beginning, take a moment to think before you buy into the media spin. And that